Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the event, the workshop on race and caste, which is sponsored by the Center of South Asian Civilizations at the University of Toronto. I am Malavika Kasturi. I am an associate professor of South Asian history at the Departments of History and Historical Studies, University of Toronto, Mississauga, and also a member of the Center for South Asian Civilizations. We are very proud and happy to be having this really important conversation between Dr. Suraj Yengde and Dr. Mbembe at a very important time and at a very important moment when we are trying to sort of think about not just caste when we talk about India, but to look at the issue of race and caste as part of a global continuum and languages and categories of subordination and suppression. So this is a moment, even as we have seen in more recent times, that the caste oppression sort of played out on the bodies of women in Mr. Narendra Modi's, India, in Uttar Pradesh, where sort of upper caste oppression, which is played out on the bodies of Dalit women, is aided and abetted by the chief ministers of a BJP-ruled state. At the same time, this is also the moment where sort of the class action lawsuit by Cisco has recognized caste as a valid sort of and an important sort of category of oppression, which actually has cognizance and importance in the US. This also comes at a time when Isabel Wilkerson's really important book, which on caste, right, The Lies That Divide Us, suggests that in fact these languages of sort of caste and race are completely linked, and they're part of these global languages of subordination and suppression, right? And who better to, in fact, talk to us and begin a conversation about this than Dr. Yangre and Dr. Mbembe. So I would like to first introduce our distinguished speakers who have sort of, joined us across different time zones, as have many of you who are listening to this conversation. So both our speakers need no introduction, but I still would like to, sort of very briefly, in some senses, try and sort of connect the most important threads of their very distinguished CVs. Dr. Yangre is a senior fellow at Harvard Kennedy School, and he's also postdoctoral fellow at the Initiative for Institutional Anti-Racism and Accountability at Harvard. He holds a PhD from the University of Witwatersrand. He is the author of Caste Matters and The Radical in Ambedkar, and he is very engaged both in his scholarly work and as a public intellectual in issues of the intersections between caste, race, and ethnicity studies, and particularly in the intersection of Dalit and Black studies. He has won a number of numerous awards and has participated in numerous discussions in the ongoing sort of atrocities, caste atrocities, and in questions of race, as Black Lives Matter has sort of, has kind of has escalated in since the summer of 2020. So Dr. Mbembe is a poet and a political scientist. He has an extremely distinguished CV, but I will suffice it to say that he's currently a research professor of history and politics at the Wits Institute for Social and Economic Research in Johannesburg, and has held visiting positions in a number of universities, including Duke, Columbia, and Harvard. He has authored a number of books, especially the highly influential Thoughts on the Post-Colony, and he's currently a contributing editor of Public Culture. Now, as this is a workshop and not quite a seminar, we are going to have a format in which the conversation will be initiated by Dr. Yangre, who will be sort of, in a sense, beginning the conversation between our two distinguished guests. And after Dr. Yengde's introduction to the conversation, then Dr. Mbembe will respond. After that, after their sort of 10-minute presentations, the second part of their conversation with each other will involve them speaking to each other. In a sense, building and bouncing off the questions that emerge from their respective presentations. And then after that, the second hour, 11 to 12, we are going to be opening up the floor for questions. So I request all those attending to please keep their videos off and their mics on mute, and please send your questions to the Gmail account, raceandcaste@gmail.com, as we have disabled the chat. And so I look forward to this discussion and interacting with all of you. So I would like to invite Dr. Yengde to first to initiate this event by making his presentation. Thank you. Over to you, Dr. Yengde.
Thank you so very much, Malvika, for that kind, generous introduction and warming us up for what would be, in many ways, it is a historic conversation, and we will come to that. But also, let me give shout out to the South Asian Civilizations Department and the colleagues at University of Toronto. And when particularly, I would like to mention Ajay Rao, dear friend. We've been planning this since the beginning of this year, and I'm glad that until November arrived, we are finally doing it in 2020. We also meet at a very peculiar time, and this conversation on race and caste has now become almost a concern, if not central concern, of humanistic projects of our times. With more of such conversations, we hope that caste then centralizes into the project of humanities as well as social sciences, of course not limited to, but expand to other cross disciplines. I would also like to thank and give a shout out to my dear friend Chinaya, who was also quite instrumental in making sure that we do this conversation. And finally to Achille, my professor and mentor at WITS, when I went and under whose academic influence I've learned a great deal, and I tend to channel that attitude of investigation into my own research as well. Today, in a sense that the question of race is almost a settled phenomenon in a broader disciplinary approaches, while caste has yet to receive that status. The career of caste has not yet received that sense of attention and critical affection to give a composite picture of what the humanity that lies within caste system. Before I begin, I just wanted to share a couple photographs with you all. That's my grandmother from my father's side, and that's my uncle and his kids. This is my grandmother from my mother's side, Sarubai. This is my grandfather from my mother's side. And obviously this is me. The reason I present these pictorial representation to you is to try to make a case of how then do we underscore the caste humanity of the people who have been oppressed for so long that their identities even have to be, for their concern and their identities, a case has to be made. When in fact, given their lived reality, we don't see much of an investment to underscore their experiences as well as their universalist values and worldviews. We wanted to do this workshop with an Afrocentric perspective, because usually when we talked about race and caste, it was almost overwhelmingly with race as it was in USA and caste as it was in India. Now, both of this do find similarities and are having historical references to fall back to. However, these both conversations need to be taken out and expanded to other geographies whose potential we will see now being noticed. For the caste project, what we have in current times is an obsessive attention given to the South Asian geography, and for race to the African geography. Of course, race then becomes a different lingua if you go into to the global north, and how it manifests while interacting almost in friction and in fatality with the erstwhile slave owning or colonial class. In the caste context, the career of caste also has transoceanic epistemologies. It translates itself from being a lower caste or being an untouchable to being an indenture. And of course, then scaling into what we have, a diasporic space. So caste is not necessarily only a Indian/Hindu problem or a predicament, but it has a wider space for it to get recognized and acknowledged. And it has manifested in various ways and modified forms. But the appropriate lens on caste has not been deployed by necessary anthropologists or sociologists who tend to study the diasporic cultures, especially when it comes to the South Asians. There are two propositions we have. One is race and caste, and the potential of race-based understanding of humanism along with the caste-based understanding of humanism. There is second, which is castes across the world. And this is a proposition that is as old as the pre-American or the enslavement of Africans and transportation of those people, not only across the Atlantic, but also within the European geography. The Iberian space was already matured with slave and slaveries, as much as it was very much in tune and in peace with caste. As we know, caste is an invention of an Iberian peninsula. The castas, which is a graded division, comes from Portuguese, and it gets translated and transported into different geographies. Now, what we have right now is an intellectual project where how does race and caste feature into our common human project when it comes to the critique of past 200 to 300 years of colonization, slavery, as well as contemporary forms of oppressions, what Achille Mbembe calls neo or para colonialisms, and looking especially through the Fanonian lens. In our current times, what we undergo as a common humanity is the conditions that are almost parallelly, equivalently held against us, which finds its way into a neoliberal form of cultural ethics, And second, the traditional form of preserving of values, where Make America Great Again becomes a rallying cry for someone to hold on to the traditional values. Now, these are the concepts that we can talk in the context of opposition to other culture. And when I say other culture, I mean to say in a culture of otherizing, which is other quote unquote nation, quote unquote a race, a quote unquote ethnicity. But what about the issues that you have to deal with within your own context? Caste, if it has to face its enemy, it doesn't necessarily always have an oppositional face in terms of white person or a black person, but it has the same melanin carrying person as someone who's invested in retaining the caste statistics. While, how does then the question remains, if Black Lives Matter is ushering in the global north, would that have purchase in the Black continent? What are then the new ways to frame our dialogues? And that's why I was looking at the concepts of caste within African context. And there has been an enormous amount of literature, especially during the colonial era, the anthropologists of the times who excavated the caste-like similarities into the context of Africa, but also in Latin America. Now, these caste-based analogies do not get the same career as the caste in India did. The credit was, of course, goes to Ambedkar, who refined this idea and presented in not only academic sense, but gave it a wheel so that it can become a vehicle to rally for if it has to do with anti-Brahminism or anti-colonialism or capitalism. So these were the concepts that were deployed in African context, especially in West Africa, while Cheikh Anta Diop, the leading thinker, acknowledged existence of caste, but he provided the peculiarity and the difference of how caste operated. For example, in Senegal, the Gir caste community he was talking about, where he said it is not as oppressive and punitive as the Hindu caste system is in India. Here, if somebody is oppressing based on caste values, one has to take on the disadvantages imposed upon community. So we have Nino, then we have communities in Mali, we have communities, the Osu and Ohu in Nigeria. If you go to the East African coast, among the Wata community, and as we continue to distill more refined perspective of caste. So caste has a career also in Africa, but then that perspective is not yet matured and yet not yet taken as a new project for our time. So this was one of the agendas to then think together, think alongside, how can we uplift the humanity of those caste oppressed people who sometimes not fall into the logic of a race as in a victim category, who are still bound by their space, class, ethnic, and if you will, the caste tribal status.
Okay, thank you so much, Suraj, for that, packing so much into a limited period of time. This itself could be, something that we can unpack. So I now invite Achille to respond to Suraj's opening comments. Over to you, Achille.
First of all, I would like to say how happy I am to participate to this workshop. I would like to thank particularly Jay, the Institute or the Center, Malavika, and Suraj, whom we miss very much here in Johannesburg, and who has done accomplished tremendous work in reconnecting, let's say, the African continent, the African archive in particular, and the archives of this region, South East Asia. I learned a lot from what he shared with us, I will make a few brief comments, if only to, let's say, start our conversation. I would first of all like to observe that this conversation is not happening in the void. It is happening, as Malavika said, at a very particular time, a time which is, among others, characterized by a systematic effort worldwide, not only in India or in Africa, to target certain categories of the population. A systematic effort to sponsor various kinds of violence against them, including, for that matter, mob violence, to target their leaders, to target their institutions. All of this in the name, of course, of peace and security, or for that matter, in the name of purity and the safeguarding of identity. As Arjuna Padurai has written recently, the most terrifying thing about contemporary politics is what we could call the extension of the right to brutalize others, and to do so with the near guarantee of no legal consequence. And so our conversation is happening within this context. It's also a context worth to mention this, since, I mean, as we speak, the United States of America is locked in a kind of electoral stalemate. It's a context I would characterize as marked by para-civil war. Fact that we found ourselves trapped within irremediably divided nation states, in which large segments of the people with contrasting sets of commitments share almost nothing in common, seem to owe each other no debt or obligation whatsoever. In fact, only aspire to secede, to separate from each other. So this desire for apartheid, I think, has to be, let's say, dealt with, if indeed the kind of project Suraj is talking about has to take shape. So I agree with almost all that he said. I will not address the issue of what distinguishes caste from race, or for that matter, slaves and untouchables, or whether race in the modern world should be better thought of as caste. Suffice it, I think, to note that Ambedkar himself compared the two inhuman systems, pointing out the level of segregation and the degree of psychological damage caused by each of them. And it seems to me, and this is a fact, that although we might also want to take into, let's say, it seems to me that we might also want to take into consideration one important reality. As we all know, the law of slavery permitted emancipation. If I understand it well, in untouchability, there is no escape. Once an untouchable, always somewhat untouchable. Then from what I understand, caste is fundamentally, just like race, a social construction. But we might also imagine that as a code and as a stricture of everyday life, it shapes, of course, racist behavior and institutions. It ultimately is a primary instrument and expression of racist behavior and institutions. That's how I would define it. This being the case, I would not reject outright attempts at using caste to picture the landscapes of racism, either in the past or in our times, nor would I reject attempts to use race as a device to offer a new picture of the caste world of India, for instance. Now, this having been said, I understand, of course, that caste crystallized over several millennia of Indian history, that it primarily partook of a cosmology, a framework, if you want, which allowed and still allows locally dominant groups to organize their local subordinates into a system which conflates rank, occupation, purity, all of that into a single status system. Then, of course, there is the matter of purity and pollution, of who is above whom, who is below whom, driving source, if I understand it well, of caste ideology in India, but also, and Suraj mentioned this, in parts of West Africa. So we can go on and on that. It's a point clearly that needs further sociological, let's say, investigation. Let me say two more things, and then maybe we can open up the discussion. As I said in my short introduction, it seems to me that to rethink the caste and race predicament today, we need to recognize a number of things. First of all, we need to recognize their planetary dimensions. So how do we do that? How do we account for the planetary turn of the caste and race question? I think is a decisive dimension of what we could call a new critical inquiry or new critical theory. Second, we cannot account for the planetarization of this predicament if we don't acknowledge that at its basis is a foundational insecurity. Insecurity faced by subaltern people, superfluous people, no matter where they are, no matter their condition, let's say nationality, religion, and so forth and so on. Insecurity in the sense that their physical safety, their corporeal and psychic integrity, all of that is under threat, in the sense that they are constrained to conduct their lives in milieus, in environments, and a world always already rendered inhospitable and inhabitable for them. So that is absolutely important. Now, Suraj mentioned the intellectual agenda. Last point, I think that intellectual agenda is inseparable from a political struggle. Political struggle, and if here I may very quickly draw from the experiences of struggles against racism, the core of that struggle has to do with abolition. Abolition, and historically we have experienced, have gone through experiments in abolition or abolitionist politics, the abolition of colonialism, of apartheid, before that, the abolition of slavery. And in most instances, some of these struggles have been concluded with small victories. But the fact is that racism has not been eliminated. And that racism has not been eliminated is a matter we absolutely need to tackle with the utmost urgency. This would be the case also, of course, with caste. It seems to me, and I'm coming to an end, that racism's tenaciousness, just as caste tenaciousness and caste's seeming intractability, all of that needs to be dealt with. It's not only that racism and caste are social constructions. It is not only that they are like cracks in the Liberty Bell, they are foundational to the kind of world order made possible by and inherited from the past. So in order to pursue these abolitionist politics, we need to re-engineer, it seems to me, a kind of reparative impulse. And that politics of abolition and that politics of reparation hopefully will lead to forms of recognition that go beyond simply the fact of citizenship. Thank you.
Thank you, Suraj and Achille, for these very powerful presentations, and in fact, and Achille's very important reminder that we have to connect epistemologies seeking social justice to politics and the structures of power that in many senses constrain and in the era, of course, of the rise of populism and of authoritarian states throughout the globe. So I would like to ask Suraj to respond to Achille's questions and that he has raised. We just need to be a little mindful of time because we have 20 minutes and we have some really interesting questions coming in. So, we hope to sort of start our interaction with the audience at 11. So please, Suraj, over to you.
Thank you so much, Achille. Actually, the political agenda is, I think, also very crucial, and I would like to for us to collectively think perhaps what will it take for us to be politically in line, in tune, in solidarity, sharing the strategies or the archives, or even the burden of oppression, and of course the methods of fighting it back, the past century. And I recall, Achille, in 2015, I asked you about the potential of humanities. And I told you that the post-colonial framework has been worked out so effectively and eloquently that there could also be many things that could be done. Then, of course, the global South paradigm in the post-Cold War and contemporary times came. And I said, what is it for 21st century? In your signature smile, you looked at me and you said, that is for you to decide. And I'm still, thinking about this century and the importance of this century, because there are various ways one can interpret our humanity 300 years ago. In India, the colonial, especially European colonial, has at most 200 years of a presence, legally 90 years of presence on the continent. Then how then do we account to the stories that do not fit into the privileged status of post-colonial logic? Within even the subaltern space, the subaltern was allowed to be a labor or a peasant, but he was not allowed to be a Dalit. And I think that is a strong indictment, where you don't see a critique of caste, even supplementing this thesis. And partly reason is the people who were deciding the course of subalternism were themselves Brahmins, who were themselves vested in the structure of maintaining a Brahminism. Yes, then we move on to a contemporary times where the second or third generation Brahmin progenies or the dominant caste progenies still want to investigate that canon. What that has done is, for a person like me, it was to then leave global north and come down to global south and spend time in this continent, on this continent, and rub my shoulders and share my notes with the Black political struggle. And as you would know, I was active in student movement there until, of course, the Fees Must Fall came, and I left before that. But in this broader dynamics, I was thinking, for Dalits, politically, Africa is first, it's close to how we identify ourselves. But also in a political sense, in an international rights-based regime, we have 54 countries on the continent. If we are able to work with and expand beyond the religious dictums of either Christianity or Hinduism, if you will. So there is a vast scope for people like me and people like yourself to start spending time with each other, because I think the effectual project is then to uplift those oppressed voices, and in effect also to try to look out at the oppressed group within Africa, especially. And I was reading this piece by a Nigerian a novelist and author who wrote for New Yorker. She filed at least 2 years ago a couple of pieces on her great-grandfather being a slave holder. And in that, she goes into how then the slaves were actually existing on this continent, which had very little to do with the European intervention of slavery. It was advancement. But here, the caste oppressed people on the continent were the slaves of the ruling, if you will, dominant caste, or there could be a new vocabulary for us to develop upon. And I think that is where I am more concerned, and that was the question. Maybe I want to pose it again to you: is to how then do we recover from the archives of the people you work with, and of course you also work with the pre-colonial archives, the philosophical and political thought that not necessarily is only confined to Africa, but there are also other spaces. Right now we almost have a competition of what is the oldest civilization. And for me, civilization cannot, if a civilization cannot hold human dignity and rights to the center, is not a civilization, it's a brutalization. And so the Indian concept of civilization for Dalits has often been the episodes of brutalizations. So when we have an ethic of Asian material theory or Indian material theory, there is very little I find my humanity being appreciated or even given a space for if you will, a carapace to shell ourselves. And that's why the Dalit humanity, the logos of Dalit livelihoods, the Dalit humor, the Dalit love, the essential aspects of recipes of Dalit survival in the genocidal attacks on them as a community doesn't get featured, doesn't get recognized. And that's why when we talk about the Black humanism, there is so much, I feel, relying upon because of their genesis to look at this issue through an origin perspective. But also, I am falling short to connect with the people who would be like me on the African continent.
Achille, would you like to respond to that?
Very, very briefly, I mean, these are all very complex issues that would require extensive development. Suraj, the way I hear you is that you, and I hear your critique of some of the so-called post-colonial traditions or subaltern studies, should I say, traditions, is that, let me put it this way, there's a big différent in the Lyotard sense that you are putting your finger on. A big différent in the sense that the archive, whether one say the global south or colonized people, it's in fact a contentious archive. It is contentious in the sense that it is almost always constituted at the expense of somebody, some form or the other of humanity. And we see it in the African context, where, as you know very well, internal slavery did exist. In fact, there have been three forms, historical forms of enslavement. The whole trans-Saharan, Arabian, Indian Oceanic slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade, which has acquired such a hegemonic position in our imaginations of liberation, or, as I was saying a moment ago, of abolition, and internal historical dynamics of enslavement, which are, of course, have been the object of anthropological historical studies, but not always of explicit political, let's say, articulations in the service of a broader emancipation. So it seems to me that we therefore have to reopen the archive, to speak in very generic terms, knowing very well that what constitutes the archive is what are called, borrowing from Lyotard, the différent. Different kinds of différents, depending on historical periods, and so on and so on. Knowing also that some of those différents, those antagonisms, might be irreconcilable. And yet, the demand imposed upon us by the times is nevertheless to open up a political space or a form of the political which must, of course, of necessity, organize one form or another of not just peaceful coexistence, but a form of coexistence that is grounded on some form or the other of justice, of universal justice. To make that possible, in the knowledge that the conditions that make this coexistence possible are always unstable. And the return to antagonisms, the return of antagonisms, is an ever-present possibility. The thing is then, what could be an ethics of the common world or the common earth, if this is the case? So it seems to me that we have to open up the discussion along those lines if we want to answer the kinds of critique, or let's say prolong the kinds of critique you are directing in particular towards post-colonial traditions of thought.
Thank you, Achille. You know, this conversation has been so rich. It's been so full of possibilities, and sort of I have my own sort of questions, many of them, but one for me would be, you know, how do we also engage with the intersectionalities within subaltern groups, right? Who are, whether they're sort of by race or class, and how do those intersectionalities actually move us towards both epistemologies and a politics, you know, of social justice. But I leave my questions for now, because I think we have a very engaged and intense audience, and we have already started receiving questions. So I will actually come back to my question if there's time. So I'd like to actually ask that we have 5 questions, and they are both, they're all addressed to both of you. So what I'm going to do is to just read them out and then perhaps have you both respond. So is that all right? Okay, so the first question is from Kristen First, which says, my question for both Achille and Suraj is about the question of emancipatory and or revolutionary politics. In Brutalism, Achille has a critique of identity politics and instead encourages other ways of seeing ourselves and envisioning alternative imaginaries to the multiple crises of the present. Can Achille and Suraj please speak to how they think revolutionary politics can be enacted in this conjecture, which is characterized by so many simultaneous crises? And relatedly, what might be a way to emancipation from racial and caste-based oppressions in this particular conjunctural context? So, over to you both. And either can begin. It's a very complex question.
Let me just begin, Suraj, because I know that you will come with more. The person who asked the question was referring to a book I have just published at the beginning of the year called Brutalism. It's not yet translated in English, because I write in the other colonial language, which is French. And indeed, in that book, there's a chapter in which I develop at length a critique of identity politics. A critique I won't have the time to elaborate on here because, of course, we are short of time, but a critique that goes somewhat along the following lines. There was a moment in our recent history, modern history, when identity or the politics of identity was, to put it shortly, emancipatory. It was emancipatory in the sense that those who had been excluded from history, from time, from the polis, P-O-L-I-S, from the world, were using it, those who have been assigned to difference, instructed to act as if they were different, embraced that difference and used it as leverage to force whatever dominant system was in place to give them their rightful place in it, to come to the table. Such was, for instance, the example of the negritude movement. The negritude movement consisted, if you want, in us, I say us, being told we were black. The fact of blackness meant we were different. We either were not human like others, or we might be humans, but of an entirely different species of the human. And our being different species of the human only ratified our particularity, which was, of course, entirely different from the real human, quote unquote, which was universal. We pertain to the domain of the particular as opposed to that of the universal. And the negritude movement said, of course, yes, in fact, we are different. But difference is only a step in a long journey towards the reconciliation of humankind. A reconciliation the likes of Senghor wrote about in powerful terms. Suraj mentioned Fanon. Fanon didn't believe in it, didn't believe in difference. He believed in some kind of generic, radical, not sameness as such, but radical co-belonging, co-constitution, which excluded the kind of partition I've referred to. So in that sense, I mean, there have always been a kind of embedded ambiguity in the philosophies of difference and of identity. In any case, in our historical experience, it seems to me that today, identity and difference are in fact have become cogs in the neoliberal machine. The neoliberalism is using difference and identity as the new opium of the masses. This is not always the case, but it seems to me that we can no longer really articulate a proposition about identity today without paying attention to the ways in which conservative philosophies of identity and difference are part of rather a machinery of new machinery of subordination. So that's the thing.
Suraj?
Thank you, Achille. I am actually, as a sincere student, when your book came out, Brutalism, the interviews of on that book came out, so that were in English. So I read them, and when I read them, I was first of all, instead of talking on the identity politics, I wish to focus on what's coming out in the current times of TikTok generation, is the wokeness of politics, and how limiting it is. In one of your interviews, I think, Achille, you told that we cannot just, undermine a person who has the willingness to have empathy and just close that person for not belonging to this group or that group. And that basically, also comes out as a, common humanitarian project, where if one is willing to embrace or understand the other, there is a space for us to then, and this is very much of, the collective, as you're talking again through Fanon, about the broader identity of how we frame it. But also, I have slight uncomfort with emancipation. I would rather propose liberation. And there is, of course, a historical way of looking at this, because history is being our principle in our conversations, but also how does then liberation and I wrote this in my book, but they stand for me at a polar difference. Emancipation for me looks very much a Gandhian concept, whereas liberation in its totality I look at is Ambedkarian, or Malcolm X or Fanonian. And again, on the concept of Achille, in the Critique of Black Reason, you talk about black as a, of course, a fiction, but also the identity is being basically relegated to the person who owns it, the power that sits. And I think the subjectivity of Dalit has been it has received two reception. One is then objective liberal response, objective liberalism, we can call it, and the second interface to the Dalit condition is that the subjectivity has to always aspire for power when power is not existing in the space it is asked to. And this is how I will explain this too very briefly. The objective liberalism that has come to describe or interpret Dalit condition has always premised on an objective rationality of a Dalit rage, Dalit protest, Dalit anger, or even the Dalit condition. One really needs to, if you have to be objective, you really need to rationalize. And I think in a situation of a brutal apathy and atrocity on a Dalit mind and Dalit body, what it eventually does is gives if at all any, but very limited space for a Dalit to reclaim its humanity. Then shall we then just plainly embrace Fanon and go about describing violence to then be an equal being. And the objective liberalism has come in various colors. It has come in Marxist color. It has come in, of course, the nationalist color, and in a neoliberal form. That objective liberalism is held against the Dalit response to their brutality. And now in a space for Dalit to reclaim power, because a political project through the Indian Constitution is guaranteeing Dalits to aim for capturing of power. And it is promised that once you capture the power, there are conditions that you might improve, but it is not a guarantee. There is no abolition. And I think the abolition as a slogan for the oppression of Black or Dalit is, I think, very convincing to me. But here what they are doing is they are holding on to the power structures. They are holding on to the power structures and asking Dalits to be the subordinate power brokers, which means if you cannot own land, if you cannot own institutions that decide power as a negotiating instinct, then Dalits are basically relegated to the level of rentiers of the nation. And I call them the rentiers of India, because they don't own anything. And they are permanently displaced, and they become the asylum seekers of every big town when they leave their rural areas. As 74% of Dalits live in rural India. People have celebrated the village republics to call that the village condition is itself something of an egalitarian, utopian, non-European. And this is where the problem some of us have, is when we hold Europe as a arc of critique when are we going to apply the same mirror and reflect into our souls and hold our ancestors accountable to the Dalit condition? Because Dalits were untouchables when the Mughals came, Dalits were untouchables before Mughals, Dalits were untouchables when the Aryan came, and during English time, and English has gone and we still are untouchables. 50% of India in a survey acknowledged, and this is rural and urban both, to practice untouchability. There are 66 forms of untouchable practices that are normally exercised in a daily interaction. So people then who talk about emancipation in this context are the ones who would like to not talk about the 66 various ways the person in power is exercising his or her position to impose untouchability. Instead, we should propose, I think, a reasonable liberation, which is subversion of structures.
Thank you. Thank you, Suraj. Actually, we have a lot of questions and they're all really exciting. I don't think we'll be able to get to all of them. So I'm going to be asking these questions, and I will apologize to those, if we run out of time. But the next question is actually from Byron Maxey, who says, Achille and Suraj both spoke to caste in West Africa. So my quick question is as follows. How might we as scholars and researchers focused on West Africa, historical and contemporary, productively think with and about the notion of caste indigenous to the region to West Africa, based on both emic and etic definitions among Fulani, Pearl, Wolof, Songa, Igbo, etc.? This is especially given the nuanced meanings of the term in the region across a diversity of religious, sociological, and national contexts. So this is for both of you. So Achille, would you like to answer the question, and then we can go over to Suraj or either?
Do you want me to go first?
Yes.
So, because, we need to, Achille has also pointed out, we need to reopen some of of course, the material archives, but also the non-material archives that exist amongst us, but somehow we have not dealt with it appropriately. I mean, one of the reasons, if had Ambedkar not been on a national scene, we would not have talked about caste as profusely, as adamantly as we do now, because he actually did that. He not only unpacked, but he also, as I said, he gave it a vehicle so that it can then create a momentum. In the West African context, and of course there is already research done in this. It's not that there are no citations or there are no epistemological inquiries. Also, ontology of caste is already existing, and leading thinkers have already dealt with it. Now, what we need to do is need to identify how this substructure, like the three forms of slaveries Achille was mentioning about, of that, how do we then, of course, focus as a, the Europe has been a focus, but also how do we move beyond? Or when I say move beyond, I mean to say through the time, not through the only phase of reason and enlightenment that we usually deal with in our critique and in our appreciation, but that there are so much nuances that these communities and these communications can bring. Simply because we don't hear about them doesn't mean they are not articulating themselves, doesn't mean they are resisting themselves. And people who are oppressed articulate and in a form of revolt, and their revolt is not necessarily recognized as a, if you will, caste revolt or against a hegemonic structure, but it is premised and looked upon as a post-colonial failure of a broader promise. So there are various ways we can perhaps think alongside the existing models that we have now.
As Suraj said, there are a number of works on castes in West Africa, in particular. These are societies that are extremely complex. I mean, colonial anthropology pretended that they were not complex. In fact, they are extremely complex. For instance, in most of those societies, there is almost an infinity of ranks. And not all the ranks do coalesce into castes. These are also societies where the top of the caste system, of course, is or pretends to be permanently closed. It pretends to be unquestionable, and yet it is constantly put into question through a whole set of modalities. I mean, the griot being those who question it the most. These are also societies where the bottom is extremely porous, if only in the sense that everyone always has somebody who is lower than them. The woman, the youth, and so forth and so on. So that porosity and elasticity is something that we haven't paid sufficient attention to. And it is also evidence of the fact that what we have here presents some of the characteristics of the exclusionary logic of race, and yet it cannot be entirely reduced to that. So there is a space of ambivalence and tension which is constantly to be negotiated in social orders that are, even when they look absolutely hierarchical, hydraulic, I would say, are always somewhat do have resources for instability. So it seems to me that that's some of the directions new research on caste in West Africa in particular should go. The point being to find out then what are the political possibilities that can be harnessed out of a system as unstable and yet with pretense of hydraulicity as I have described it.
Thank you, Achille. Now I'll move on to the next question, which is about Muslim racialization and how it maps onto caste and race by Sanubar Omar. And I'm going to again read out this question. I apologize, some of these questions are a bit long. She says, Achille Mbembe has touched upon this work on Palestine, and there is ongoing work on the complicated histories and politics of Pasmanda Muslims in India, South Asia, by scholars like Tanveer Fazal. In recent times, some scholars such as Mustafa Bayoumi have persuasively argued that Islam as a religion itself is racialized, which has implications for how we understand the figure of the Muslim in contemporary times as without race and caste, but through a myopic and exclusive focus on their religious identity. So her question is, how then, given this, do we place these symmetries of caste and race in relationship to these conversations on religion as a form of otherization / hierarchization? This is particularly important given the silence of the international community and mainstream Indians as Kashmir gets occupied and Indian Muslims face the real threat of statelessness, and many have already found themselves in detention camps. Because unlike Brahmanical notions which require Dalits to be a feature of Hindu Rashtra, quote unquote, Muslims need to be expelled or purged altogether. So this is, I think, a pertinent and very timely question for our um, for both our panelists. So please. So Suraj, would you like to go first?
Right.
With no prejudice to
No.
either.
I mean, of course, I mean, Achille has given a lot. He has received flack also for taking a position of Palestine, and they called him all kinds of negative, nasty, but he's been holding on strong on that one. And also, I would like to extend my solidarity to the Palestinian struggle and to our comrades and friends who are fighting for the right to live and sovereignty. The question of caste, that's why we need to not only excessively, obsessively Hinduize it only. We need to present the cosmology of caste, under which the substratum of other religions then build up to. Even with the Islamic literature, we can see how caste values were very central. The idea of purity, and juxtaposing that with the idea of governance. So you have many at least in Middle Eastern societies, the supremacy of a ruling tribe or clan or ethnicity. There are various names to that. I know a work by my friend who's doing in Yemen about the Hashmi group who wants to retain supremacy by having the most closeness to the Prophet Muhammad. And that kind of then of course translates into other forms of societies where it gets co-opted into the native cultural values while the supremacy or purity remains intact. And that happens when it arrives in the South Asian context, where the feudalism that was already existing, a solid caste structure where the feudal order was sanctimonious. In that, the if you will, the colonization of the Mughals or the Islamic regime in India produced its novel form of purity plus Brahminism, which was again premised on not only purity but exclusion of impure bodies, if you will. And in that, the supremacist values were then recreated, where the people who were already desperate to get the certificate of belonging to the Prophet's family, or to establish their genuine, if you will, the spiritual cause or the crusade of Islam, then got easily accepted in the Brahminic spaces. And that's why you will see many dominant caste Brahmins, the dominant caste Musalmans belong to Brahmin or the other dominant caste communities. Same situation we have in Kashmir, where the Kashmir caste question has not been adequately dealt with. However, with the new assertion of caste politics, we are now witnessing the people who belong to the lower castes, or who are in profession not belonging to the muftis and the sayyids and the shahs, who are of course imported, or the categories originally belonging to Persia or that part of the geography, are now also have to tackle these questions. And I think this is again, I don't know why it is, but Fanonian question is important as to what do you do when you liberate? Do you utilize the same praxis to oppress your own people, or you cultivate new forms? And it is in this light, I think, the question of Islam, especially Pasmanda, the lower caste, but also the Ajlaf, the untouchables, need to be given province so that we can have a clear-cut analysis of the Muslim condition. The Hindu Muslimization, the dichotomy, the binary of these two has harmed the real condition of the Dalits or the tribal people, because the Hindu-Muslim canon is again a canon of the elite, oppressed, of course, on a religious line, the lower caste, but the people who are oppressed while being Muslims are not necessarily the dominant caste Muslims, but these are the lower caste or the Dalit converts or the tribal converts into Islam in India.
Achille, would you like to engage with the question?
No, because frankly, I I'm not competent on this matter, and I appreciate the fact that Suraj has given us a very encompassing set of responses and lines of inquiry we can then prolong after this discussion.
So I'll move on to the next question, which is from Mekola Gomes, which says, so much of Professor Mbembe's work, such as necropolitics, describes in sweeping terms the new emerging bleak infrastructure globally of extreme and gratuitous violence, calibrated along the lines of race particularly, but also by extension along the lines of caste as well. Electoral politics seems particularly bankrupt, but what are the avenues for escape? I think this is a question for you, Achille, but it could also be, and Suraj is something to also engage with if you like.
Yes. And look, I would love to be really optimistic, but I'm not sure that that is the real question. Wherever we look at, we see a proliferation of conflicts over basic values. Such conflicts are unfolding, often in the absence of basic agreements concerning what is legitimate and what is not. In most political societies today, it's hard to know what is true and what is not, what is fake, because the minimally shared normative foundations for a democratic life are evaporating, or to use Wendy Brown's term, democracy is being hollowed out by all kinds of factors. We don't have the time to go through each of them. And because these minimally shared normative foundations for a democratic life are evaporating, it ensues that opposing positions can no longer peacefully coexist within a common symbolic space. Rather, antagonistic and compromising and almost, I would say, irreconcilable views of social reality now prevail. And as a result, democracies are increasingly speaking the language of enmity, of excommunication, of eradication. And I think this obviously shapes to a large degree the politics both of race, of caste, of gender, of religion, and so forth and so on. Now, how do we get out of this? I really don't know. If I knew, of course, I would say it. But it seems to me that one way to at least begin to properly frame the issues is to pay attention carefully to the state of our Earth, of the planet, to come gradually to the recognition that our history, when I say our, I mean the humans, our history on Earth might not be eternal. That, in fact, it's a distinct possibility that the earth might continue to live after us. So what I mean by that is maybe a way of rediscovering the common. What is it that, how do we recompose the earth in order to re-inhabit it and to open it up to all who live in it? Exactly like the South African Freedom Charter puts it. The first sentence of the Freedom Charter is, South Africa belongs to all who live in it. Questions of race, caste, gender, so forth and so on, have to do with the belief among some that the earth only belongs to them. And in fact, the politics of abolition, when we look at it historically, had to do with the reassertion of the fact that the earth doesn't only belong to some, it belongs to all. So that question of co-belonging, of co-constitution, of relatedness, I find it deeply developed, for instance, in pre-colonial African systems of thought, where in fact we have an entirely different paradigm, which is not about being as in Western metaphysics, being in time, being in this. You read all of them, Heidegger, Hegel, Sartre. It's always around being, ontological matters. In African pre-colonial systems of thought, relation, composition are the key categories, both of identity, if we have to use that term, or of the political as such. And in that sense, we can enrich democracy, the concept of democracy, of the rule of self, by expanding the concept of the self beyond the human as such, beyond the citizen. But these are philosophical considerations. It's not a manifesto. It's not a 10-point program. But it's part of what Suraj was inviting us to do, to re-exercise our imagination and to rethink the key categories with which we have become accustomed to account for our existence and for the world at large. That's how I see it.
Thank you. So Suraj, would you like to engage with that? That's fine. Okay. So there's a question by Prasad Bidaye who says, this is a question for both of you. Prasad says, I really appreciate Professor Yengde's call to transpose the categories of caste and race across different geographies. But I think it's also important to remember the colonial legacy of conflating these terms, especially in the South Asian context of defining caste as Aryan or Dravidian, as Aryan Dravidian racial struggles. So I think the question here is, and the comment is that while we make the linkages between racism and casteism, are there any concerns that we may be re-entering a phase of conflating the two rather than seeing their intersections? Also, how can we avoid this conflation theoretically as well as in activism? So it's kind of a collective question, but if Suraj, you'd like to kind of take it on, yeah.
Right. I think the inquiry is right. The conflation of, and we cannot undermine the role of colonial archive, but also a colonial bureaucracy in anthropologizing, and of course conflating these terms Achille was talking about, especially in the West African context. This is such a complex system that it cannot be reduced to this macro categories. But that is what caste is. It is not justifying the macro category. It is actually uplifting the subcaste and even sub-subcastes. And that's why the broader caste groups are 6,000 plus. But if you include subcastes, then we are talking something beyond. And when we worship, when we marry, when we create relations, when we control somebody, when we employ somebody to do the lower work, or we worship somebody, it is your subcaste consciousness that is at play. And so one needs to be extremely sensitive to how they describe this a new project of inquiries, critical inquiries, but also need to pay attention to how caste offers us a potential to recognize that complexities. Certainly, the colonial, if you will, the laziness categorized it in its immediacy for a census purposes, and we all know census was one of the reasons that they needed to bring this. But also, we cannot obsessively only focus on the limitations of the first effort, if you will, of providing a composite picture, because caste is so complex that in one state, Achille, caste is untouchable; in other states, it's not. When you talk about the porousness of that, but that is not the question of a bureaucrat. That is a question of science. That is a question of philosophy. That is a question of intellectualism. That is how we need to reimagine our locus into this. And I think why I want to push for this agenda or this project is not for race and caste to contest, contrast, or even conflict each other's. It's not, as they say, the Olympics of victimhood, but it is about understanding how the humanity is shaped under this normative discourses, and how it now utilizes the same discourse to fight back, and to kind of go back to Achille's initial introductory remark as to how then we utilize this space to fight back, to revolt, to create a new forms of abolitionist politics. And I think that's why the race caste is not race versus caste or race hyphen caste necessarily. It's race and caste. Can these categories coexist? I think they can, but also they need to address each other more critically than just mere assumptions of our own, anti-colonial, if you will, the thought that we propose in this.
Achille, would you like to come in on this, or should we move on to the next question?
No, I think we can move on because Suraj addressed it extensively.
Okay. So there's more than one question, which is actually asking you both to engage with Isabel Wilkerson. So I'll just read out one of them. And so this is a question in two parts. Again, these are very long questions, so I'm afraid you're going to have to kind of keep track of this. I'm just going to read this out. This is from Bart Scott, which says, I'm so struck by Suraj's rendering of caste via the Iberian space, which of course is empirically correct and well known. But but as he suggests, has perhaps not received the kind of careful critical elaboration that he's giving it, especially in terms of tracing a notion of caste or casta in Spanish and Portuguese colonial spaces around the Atlantic. So my question is this, I suppose. In what ways does this framework have a destabilizing effect for caste studies? In this framework, do caste studies and Dalit studies start to have strongly divergent trajectories? One linked to the global flows of empire, the other to a more specific millennia-long South Asian history. What are the political implications of such a divergence? Does this foreground the post-colonial as a frame for thinking caste or Dalit lives? And finally, he asked, in conversation with Isabel Wilkerson's Caste, I've seen suggestions that one thing that tends to get lost in translation from India to the US is religion. Caste, by this account, sanctifies social hierarchy to uphold it. So what is your collective view? What in your collective view is the place of religion in thematizing the analogy between race and caste? This question has one set of trajectories in India, of course, and another in the US. One thinks of Judith Weisenfeld's work on the religio-racial body. But I'm especially curious about the question of how religion takes shape if we are working from, as you say, an Afrocentric framework. So this question is for both of you, and it's a long question. If you like, I can sort of.
No, it's amazing, and I think thank you to the questioner or what's the name?
Bart Scott.
Thank you. And I think it really requires us to. It is actually a interdisciplinary question, and its potential lies in how creative can we be in elaborating that. At least I see two prominent themes. One is obviously the impact of what will happen to the Dalit studies or Dalit movement if we underscore the global caste phenomenon, and second is if you look through the religion as a carapace which has remained intact, how does that communicate or miscommunicate? I will just offer one quick comment on the first question as to I think it has a huge potential because Dalit has been reduced to of course a negative identity, but it has left its the structure has maintained or given Dalits a right to fight for themselves only in a very internal context. Their universalism, their potential to be a global citizen, a global pacemaker has not really ejected out of their own localities. And I think the Dalit perspective also needs a desirous attention, not only because of its history, but also because of its how it calculates the values of liberal or liberties, and then refashions it for their own liberation. And I think there are various groups that we can underscore by looking at this, because how do you categorize those groups who do not necessarily fall under the colonial frameworks or post-colonial liberation frameworks? There are certainly groups who remain obscured or not dealt with as one should have expected within these traditions that we intellectualize. But in a race caste, or in this case, the global caste context, there is an opportunity. What Achille has said and acknowledged is there has not been enough done in those spaces, and that's Achille, probably the agenda for this generation of scholarship to take upon and to creatively rethink how do we revisit and reread these same notes that have been written. And to the second question, I think the religion argument is well taken. The potential of every religion, this is the fact that religion has given to the hegemon of caste in this context, and so does it happen, as I learned from my colleagues in Senegal and in Nigeria, where either Christian or Islamic, but also non-Christian, non-Islamic practices yet get confounded to the caste values.
Achille?
But here again, I don't really have much to add to what Suraj said. I mean, some of the questions are framed as lines of inquiry, and one can only endorse them and then go and do further work, which I'll do for the last two questions.
Okay, so and this question of religion, of course, goes back also to Sanubar's question of about the and so I think this is a really interesting thread that is moving through these many questions. I think we're going to be running out of time, but I'll move on to a question by Ananya Kabir to Suraj. It says, Which says, Carapace, you mentioned Dalit love and Dalit humor, but what about Dalit style? I'm thinking of Achille's comment in Necropolitics, the article, about the potential for resistance embodied in the gesture of stylization that the enslaved on the plantation held onto as a measure of sovereignty. Your comment.
Thank you, Ananya. We've been having this dialogue and we'll hopefully see each other soon. The style is a protest within a Dalit cultural production because style is manifested not only to reclaim your humanity, but to shame the other part of dehumanized humanity who doesn't want to give appreciation to the Dalit life worlds. Life worlds is the same word. And this has various ramifications. The Dalit style, one of the bigger or rather biggest icons is Ambedkar himself, how he refashions, of course, in a Victorian modernity when he dresses up with three-piece suit and of course it's the 20th century gentlemanly candor, but Ambedkar is doing more than that. Ambedkar is also a fleeting a response to the people who want to give up on their clothes as a and live half naked and become national leaders. Through that, the materiality of Dalit condition is not given or even it has not received warm affection because even a Dalit wearing a scarf of a certain color is now a challenging the entire dominance of the political as well as religious structural issue. And of course, I refer here to not only Chandrasekhar Azad's scarf, but also to the other women leaders, Mayawati and others, whose sartorial practices. And style is also then advancing through how you write, how you protest, and how you articulate new slogans of countering the hegemonic narratives. And this is very unique when we estimate and analyze the Dalit condition through the catalogs of if you will, the style as a metaphor to understand the Dalit humanity and as well as the Dalit universalism.
Achille, would you like to engage with the question?
Yes, look, I subscribe to all that Suraj said, and I have to thank Ananya for asking the question. I just want to add that this is a feature that we have found in practically all movements of resistance against forms of dehumanization. Just as systems of domination have their style, structures or actors or organization movements that oppose those systems of domination also tend to have their own stylistic scriptures. And this usually begins with the recentering of one's body, because most slave or racial induced systems of domination have usually tried to cripple two things, to cripple the mind and the imagination by inflicting deep psychic injuries onto the targets and to cripple the body, while in the case of slavery, trying to exploit it. Thus the paradox of something that is both indispensable and yet dispensable. the ambiguity of dispensability and indispensability. And therefore, in the act of recovering one's humanity, the body and the way in which it is dressed, it is covered, all of this becomes extremely important, an important element in the healing of the self. It's part of a politics of repair or reparation or self-reparation, if you want.
Thank you. So I have at least 3 questions which have to do with Isabella Wilkerson's book. So I'm going to ask you just one of them, given that we only have 10 minutes left. This is from Hannah Kim, who says, can Doctors Yangre and Mbembe, if possible, share a short response to Wilkerson's main argument as they see these arguments? I would like to share their responses located in their positionality with undergraduate students who have read Wilkerson's book. So this is also a question to both of you about Isabella Wilkerson's book on caste.
I like the book, and it's phenomenal intervention. It has I am actively present in the book, at least I think twice, but what it does is it advances an intellectual, at least across solidarity projects. By of course, one can critique how important or how not important those similarities are. But what Wilkerson has done is she has really recovered the stories and as well as archives of caste studies in America, which was already existing. We knew it, we would write about it, but it would not get the same affection and attention. Now with Wilkerson, especially 1960, 1940, 1930 anthropology that went into examining the Southern condition, enunciated the caste values of existing within the racial order. And so many people would be surprised that caste was a predominant discourse until the civil rights movement talked in the broader context of race. But color caste was the predominant inquiry, and one can find this in the Chicago journals of sociology and also many other anthropological works. Of course, there is a debate, but caste is very much present. And somehow almost in its reincarnation, this dialogue has come about. It has a lot of potential, at least for the world community, to recognize the existence of Dalits, because there is no United Nations resolution that acknowledges the brutality of Dalits. For Israel-Palestine issues, we have almost about 300 General Assembly resolutions by United Nations. But here, when you talk about a historically vast mass, there is not even a single resolution, even acknowledging, let alone condemning the Dalit pitiable condition.
Achille, over to you.
I agree that that question of recognition of the injuries inflicted upon the Dalits is a very important matter, and it has to be pursued, both politically, economically, in terms of reparation, and intellectual reparation along the lines Suraj has been suggesting. I think that the other thing which remains, not only for our understanding of caste, but also of race, has to do with the fact that we still don't understand why these forms of subjection why have they been so durable? Why, in spite of their not being buttressed by any evidence, why are they still so powerful? What is it in them that defies both reason and science? This is something for which social sciences have failed to account for. And that task has to be, let's see, we have to take it again and try to account for the durability.
In fact, the last question, which from Luther Obrock, actually speaks to this, and I'm going to shorten it, so I'm sorry, Luther, but he's asking whether it is possible to imagine a humanistic and critical historiography using the categories and methods that you both have laid out. So is that something that you both perhaps would like, we could close with, as we're sort of, this is an important conversation. There's something that either of you would like to engage with this question?
If it doesn't exist, then the task for our times is to invent it. I think there are elements on which we can draw upon to, let's say, conduct such a project. It's not as if we are the first to occupy ourselves with the issues we have been raising this evening. So the point is to look into both the existing archive and to constitute new archives. How do we do this is probably a question we will have to address next time. But and I'll end there. I think that this has to be done from the perspective of, let's say, inhabiting our world differently and in common. I really insist on that element of inhabitation and dwelling, because this is the only world we have, the only planet we have, where complex forms of life have developed. And the fact that it is the only one must mean something, which we have to decipher. And if we are unable to do that and reimagine a politics of the in common, then a lot of what we'll have done will lead to not much. And I understand Suraj project as being part of that broader attempt at reimagining ways of inhabiting the world and opening up to all who live in it.
Thank you, Achille. I think I will just continue with that trail of thought. Is one of the aims of this mode of inquiry is to reimagine our cartographies, and not just through a seismic episodes of few centuries of the past, but through a longer, what we call longue durée of our existence. And that's why, I trace back to the archaeological evidences of when was the difference planted in our head, so apt that over the period of time it kept getting new lives in every epoch that we dealt with this condition. And I think the future of these humanities lies in recognizing the human aspect of this, and not just relegating to another rebellious or revolting category. It's a simple human sense that we would like to uplift and amplify in our frameworks. And I think through that, Achille, my departing point is, now we are colonizing the new planets, and few greedy individuals who have already gotten on the task of destroying this universe that belongs to us is being very categorically denied our existence here, and new laws are actually being created if humanity has to colonize Mars or Moon. And Elon Musk, fellow South African, now living in Silicon Valley, has started already writing the writs of this. It's such an irony that in the country of course, the modern Messiah who talked about what you say, the African Charter, is actually writing a galaxy charter that will, of course, will leave us many doubts. But our struggle, if we continue with this sensitivity, I think we can reach to the throat of those people who are now writing our futures.
Well, I'd like to thank you both, because unfortunately we're going to have to bring this very stimulating and sort of really important conversation to an end. As you both said in your very generous comments to the questions, and there were many more that I just, had to sort of pick and choose from. I apologize to those whose questions could not be put forward. I think you've both pointed towards really important questions that we started out about sort of connecting epistemologies, these epistemologies that have to be not just humanistic, but have to be engaged with the world of everyday practice, about thinking about the way we sort of, instead of moving in silos, in new forms of kind of, of sort of, if you like, quote unquote, transnational solidarities, or even sort of different kinds of conversations, local forms of, political movements in the present. It raises also many other questions in my mind, but I think that would be in part 2. I think the Center for South Asian Civilizations would be very happy to organize a second part of this workshop. But for now, I would like to thank both our speakers as well as a very engaged audience. I would like to say that this is being recorded and it will be put up on the website of the Center for South Asian Civilizations, where those who have missed, the actual either a part or whole of this conversation can actually sort of catch up on that, and we will be in touch with you. So thank you, everybody. And I again thank both our speakers, and I think we will probably have to reach out to you again for more conversations, because this is a very troubled, we live in a very troubled space, and we are waiting for an election outcome, which might feed into the very struggles that we are talking about. So on this note, I thank you all, and I thank the audience. So
I just
and all across different time zones. And Achille, thank you especially to you, because I know it is we're all sort of working across different time zones, and this would not have been possible without everyone sort of being so cooperative. So thank you once again. And
Malvika, I just wanted to thank, I actually have at least 9 time zones represented when we started. So I want to acknowledge all of you for staying late night and also early morning. Thank you so much.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean that, right? All right.
No,
but thank you. You both did a great job of sticking to time. We are living in very unusual times. I'm looking forward to the time we actually just very discreetly slip a chit, across the table. So we live in hope, and I hope to meet you in real time. So thank you. Bye-bye.